What do you mean when you say the word I myself?
Right now, somewhere in the world, someone is listening to Alan Watts. Not in 1965, not in a Berkeley lecture hall. Right now. A voice recorded 50 years ago plays over slow-motion rain on a YouTube channel with 3 million subscribers, over lo-fi piano, over silent footage of Japanese forests at dawn, over someone's quiet morning coffee. Alan Watts died in 1973. His voice may be reaching more people now than it ever did when he was alive, which raises a question nobody seems to be asking. Why? Why does a dead British philosopher describe your anxiety, your craving, that specific feeling that something fundamental is missing, and you can't quite name what it is, with more precision than anyone who actually knows your name? That question isn't really about Alan Watts. It's about everyone who keeps pressing play. And before you say, I don't do that, you clicked on a video about Alan Watts. You absolutely do that. Honestly, same. His voice was one of the first things that made Buddhism feel like something a person could actually think about, rather than accept on faith. This video is about what comes after that. Surrey, England, 1930. A 14-year-old boy picks up a book on Japanese art and feels something shift. The relief of finding words for something he had felt for years without ever being able to name it. His name was Alan Wilson Watts, and he had a problem that England in the 1930s had absolutely no language for. Through a man named Christmas Humphreys, he found the Buddhist lodge in London, one of the only places in Britain where Eastern philosophy existed in any accessible form. Hold that room for a moment. A small circle of British seekers, academics, theosophists, and early practitioners, meeting in a Victorian building to discuss ideas that most of England had never encountered. And one boy, 15 years old, surrounded by adults decades older, feeling, for the first time, that the ideas in the room fit the shape of his mind, in a way his own culture never had. The cosmology, the doctrine, neither was the thing. Something underneath both. The sense that the self wasn't the solid, separate object he'd been told it was. That the gap between himself and the world was, in some fundamental way, constructed rather than given. He'd been carrying that feeling his whole life. He'd never had a word for it. That first encounter produced a book, The Spirit of Zen, published in 1936. Watts was 20 years old. In 1936, Zen wasn't a mood board or a tea brand or a tattoo font. It was an obscure Japanese monastic tradition that almost nobody in the English-speaking world had heard of. Walking toward it at 20, with no teacher and no community behind you, required something more than curiosity. The detail that shapes everything. Watts never trained under a recognized teacher and sustained formal practice. He studied D.T. Suzuki, whose essays in Zen Buddhism had introduced Zen scholarship to many Western readers, and absorbed Taoism, Vedanta, early Buddhism, read everything he could locate. But he was always translating from outside the monastery. That gave him freedom. It also left a hole. The church gave him a language, but not enough room. He became an Episcopal priest in America, a sincere attempt to bridge Eastern wisdom and Western faith inside an institution. Then the collar came off. No scandal, no crisis in the conventional sense. He walked away. Keep that in mind. It becomes the whole problem later. In 1957, Watts published The Way of Zen. It became a bestseller. A Japanese monastic tradition, built on decades of sitting, koan practice, and direct teacher transmission, was now sitting in mainstream bookstores beside thrillers and cookbooks. For context, this is the 1950s. The most spiritually exotic thing most Americans had encountered was a mild interest in astrology. And this British guy put Shunyata on the national bestseller list. That's either a miracle or a warning. Watts spent the rest of his life trying to figure out which. Then came the voice. Not the books, the voice. Berkeley, California, 1953. A British accent comes through a radio speaker on KPFA and starts explaining Zen to students, artists, jazz musicians, and curious strangers who had never heard the word anatta in their lives. Within minutes, they feel like they've always known it. He was among the first major interpreters of Eastern wisdom for Western audiences. And decades later, that voice would escape the lecture hall entirely. It would be sampled, looped, slowed down, layered over music, rain, clouds, forests, and late-night edits by people who discovered the voice before they ever opened a Buddhist book. Watts didn't write the songs. He didn't make the films. He didn't design the playlists. He gave the culture a vocabulary. The culture did the rest. The achievement wasn't simplification. He reframed Eastern philosophy. Shunyata, emptiness, stops feeling like nihilism and starts feeling like freedom. Anatta, no self, stops feeling like annihilation and starts feeling like relief. In the book, On the Taboo Against Knowing Who You Are, Watts describes the ordinary Western sense of self as a skin-encapsulated ego, the feeling that you are a lonely little commander trapped inside a bag of skin, looking out at a world that is somehow entirely separate from you. That phrase has probably done more to introduce people to anatta than most books written on the subject. That is the gift. The Beats adopted him. Kerouac, Ginsberg, the entire San Francisco Renaissance. Gary Snyder actually went to Japan to train in a Zen monastery. Most took the poetry and left the practice. Watts saw this forming in real time. In 1959, 2 years after the bestseller, he wrote an essay called Beat Zen, Square Zen, and Zen. He wasn't watching the counterculture from a comfortable distance. He was inside it, watching Zen become a costume, rebellion, coolness, permission to float above ordinary responsibility, and calling it out by name. He diagnosed the problem he was simultaneously creating. That essay could have been written yesterday. Replace beat poets with the wellness industry, and the argument is identical. But we'll get there. The map was beautiful. The danger was mistaking it for travel. Even critics of Watts weren't reacting to his talent for explanation. They were reacting to what explanation can replace when it becomes too satisfying to question. The door was open. Millions walked toward it. Many settled right inside the entrance and called it home. Tuesday evening, low light, headphones in. Alan Watts's voice rolls in over piano and rain. For the next 20 minutes, the noise quiets. The craving softens. Something you've been chasing all day recedes. You feel, briefly, like the version of yourself that has it figured out has surfaced for air. Then the clip ends. You close the laptop. The rain loops to silence. For 5 seconds, the room feels different, lighter somehow. Then your phone lights up. A message. A reminder. That anxious thought you'd managed to forget for 20 minutes. And the whole self you thought had dissolved rebuilds itself around you like it was never gone. The self disappeared for 3 minutes. Then came back asking for coffee. A voice that names what you've been carrying doesn't cure the weight. But for a moment, it ends a particular loneliness. The feeling that what you're carrying is yours alone. That's why his voice found so many people. That's why it keeps finding more. That's also where the trap opens. Watts didn't build it with malice. He made it beautiful enough that the modern world fell into it willingly. What's actually happening here? Watts operated with extraordinary skill at the level of intellectual understanding. He could also generate something close to direct experience in a room. People walked out of his lectures feeling something shift, not in their heads but somewhere deeper. But between those two things and liberating insight, the kind the Pali texts call vipassana, the kind that actually restructures how you live, how you relate, what the Pali calls tanha, craving itself, there's a distance, a real one. And Watts was largely silent about what crosses it. That's where listeners get stuck. The Pali term panya, wisdom, appears throughout the suttas not as something acquired by understanding teachings, but as something that emerges from practice. The Samannaphala Sutta, the Buddha's discourse on the fruits of contemplative life, makes this order clear. Ethical training comes before concentration, and concentration before insight. Understanding the fire doesn't cool the burn. Watts understood this. He returned to it, worried at it, wrote about it across his career. And then, he went back to making it sound beautiful. To be fair to him, and this matters, Watts never claimed to be anyone's Zen master. He described himself, explicitly, as a philosophical entertainer. He never pretended to be a monk. Countless listeners cast him as one anyway. Today, the same pattern operates at a scale Watts never anticipated. His recordings now form the backbone of a global wellness aesthetic. The Watts sensation, that experience of clarity in the dark, is now purchasable. A weekend retreat, a subscription, a playlist designed to deliver 4 minutes of the feeling he spent decades trying to describe accurately. He diagnosed Beat Zen in 1959 as Zen used for permission rather than transformation. What built itself on his voice did something more refined. It turned the sensation of understanding into the product itself. Transformation became optional. The sensation became sufficient. Those are genuinely different things. The channel has been here before. In What is Zen Buddhism? And When Buddhism Met Taoism, both videos looked at the gap between Zen's radical accessibility and the discipline underneath it. And in the self versus no self, Jung and Buddha's greatest debate, there's another Western mind who mapped the inner landscape with extraordinary precision, and then largely left the listener to work out what to do next. Watts is Jung's parallel in a different tradition. The pattern is the same: brilliant diagnosis, incomplete prescription. The missing bridge is simple and brutal. Hearing the Dharma is not living it. And this is where the story becomes uncomfortable, because the same trap that caught the audience also caught the man behind the microphone. First, who Alan Watts actually was in a room. Funny, sharply funny, self-deprecating in a way almost unknown for a public intellectual of his era. He laughed at his own ideas. He punctured his own solemnity mid-sentence. He had a talent for making serious things feel playful without making them feel small. In his autobiography, In My Own Way, published in 1972, the year before he died, Watts describes his contradictions with something between honesty and performance. He had a phrase he used in a conversation with Studs Terkel, said almost proudly, as though naming the thing dissolved it. A genuine fake.
I'm a bit of a fake. Maybe a genuine fake.
His own words, his own assessment. In that same autobiography, he described himself without flinching. I am a sedentary and contemplative character, an intellectual Brahmin, a mystic, and also somewhat of a disreputable Epicurean who has 3 wives, 7 children, and 5 grandchildren. He used it philosophically, the idea that authenticity and performance weren't opposites, that a person could be entirely themselves while also being fundamentally theatrical. It's a very Zen position, actually. It's also a very convenient one for a man who lived the way Watts lived. 3 marriages, each carrying a version of the same pattern. A man who spoke about metta, loving kindness, and anicca, impermanence, with breathtaking clarity, who struggled to hold both inside the same relationship simultaneously. A drinking habit that moved from social to structural. Something he couldn't put down, even as he described the freedom available to anyone willing to release their grip on craving. Stones are easy. Mirrors are harder. The question Watts's life raises is a Buddhist one. Can insight be real and remain unintegrated? Can someone describe the door perfectly and still never enter the house? He understood the illusion of the self better than almost anyone alive, and he still suffered like someone trapped inside it. In 1971, Watts recorded a lecture walking alone in the hills above Muir Woods. No audience, no performance, and he said this:
"You can't transform yourself. You can't make yourself sane, you can't make yourself loving, you can't make yourself unselfish. And yet it's absolutely necessary that we be that way."
A man who saw the problem with that precision, who set it on tape for anyone to hear, and who, by his own honest account, spent the rest of his life living the gap between seeing it and crossing it. The Studs Terkel recording from 1973, one of his final conversations, captures something unusual. Watts describes the gap between the public philosopher and the private man with a directness his public lectures almost never produced. He doesn't minimize it, he doesn't excuse it. He names it with something close to peace. And whether that peace was genuine equanimity or the most elegant way of dodging the mirror, he would have been the first to admit he couldn't be certain which. His final lecture recordings, the voice rougher, the performance more transparent, contain some of the most honest things he ever said about the limits of his own teaching. The drinking hadn't dulled the insight. It had left the insight floating, unanchored to a life built around it. He was, at minimum, extremely mature about his contradictions. The Buddhist tradition doesn't allow this to remain purely a human story about one complicated man. The Mahaparinibbana Sutta records the last words the Buddha spoke before he died. Vayadhamma sankara, apamadena sampadetha. All conditioned things are impermanent. Strive with diligence. Strive, work it out. The verb is the entire point. Describing the path and walking it are different things. A teacher can describe the path with perfect accuracy. Walking it is something else entirely. Watts knew this better than almost anyone. He said so across decades of recordings. And that knowledge, vivid, articulate, and felt, remained, in crucial ways, knowledge. Which points toward the only question that actually matters. Alan Watts made Zen sound effortless. The monks knew better. The Buddhist concept of upaya, skillful means, holds that different practitioners need different doors into the Dharma. A teaching that reaches one person fails another. The Buddha himself, across the Pali Suttas, adjusts his approach constantly. Different language, different framing, different emphasis, depending on who he's addressing. By that standard, Watts may have been one of the most effective forms of upaya the modern West ever received. Before Watts, Buddhism in the West existed in small academic circles and immigrant communities. Watts didn't create Western Buddhism, but he prepared the cultural vocabulary that made many Westerners ready to listen when teachers and communities appeared. Shunryu Suzuki's San Francisco Zen Center, founded in 1962, found audiences who already had some sense of what Zen was, because Watts had spent years making it feel accessible. The Insight Meditation Society, founded in 1975 by Jack Kornfield, Sharon Salzberg, and Joseph Goldstein, after years of training in Asian monasteries, met Westerners hungry for actual practice because Watts had helped create a climate in which that hunger could make sense. There is a scene that captures all of this better than any argument could. Watts visited Tasajara, Shunryu Suzuki's monastery in California. He'd broken a dry period on the drive down. That evening, on the back porch overlooking the creek, Suzuki sat in silence while Watts chattered nervously, getting up repeatedly to "have some of your marvelous water," each time returning smelling more strongly of alcohol. The man who could hold 1,000 people in stillness with his voice couldn't hold himself together in the presence of someone who actually practiced. The next morning, fully restored toga and staff, holding court on a bridge for dazzled guests, Watts was back. One of Suzuki's students watched this and said to Suzuki, We used to think he was profound until we found the real thing." Suzuki turned on him with sudden intensity. "You completely missed the point about Alan Watts. You should notice what he has done. He is a great bodhisattva." That word, bodhisattva, a being who helps others toward awakening. Suzuki wasn't saying Watts had crossed the river himself. He was saying Watts had spent his life building boats for other people. That is the door. This channel is part of that lineage. The 3 schools of Buddhism, one of the most watched video here, exists because an appetite for this material was already waiting. Watts helped build that appetite. Every person who heard Watts and then went looking for a teacher, a practice, a sangha, Watts worked for them. Every person who heard Watts and decided the hearing was sufficient, Watts left them at the entrance. The variable was never Watts. It was what the listener chose to do after the recording ended. Upaya has a boundary. And that boundary is exactly where the Buddhist tradition becomes demanding in a way no recording can replace. In Buddhist terms, Watts gave many people something close to samadhi, right view, a new way to see the self, suffering, and impermanence. But the Eightfold Path, Atangika Magga, has 7 more steps beyond seeing clearly. It asks whether that view changes how you speak, how you act, how you earn a living, how you pay attention, how you train the mind. Right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, right concentration. In other words, what you intend, what you say, what you do, how you earn your living, how hard you try, how clearly you pay attention, and how deeply you can stay. Sila, ethical conduct, in the Buddhist framework isn't decorative. It's the ground wisdom grows from. The Visuddhimagga makes the sequence explicit. Sila first, then samadhi, then panya. Conduct, then concentration, then insight. Without that ground, insight stays airborne, beautiful, felt, and ultimately weightless. Watts himself often resisted turning spirituality into homework. His instinct was always to point people back toward direct experience, to ask the listener to stop searching for the answer in a voice and start looking in the actual texture of their own life. That resistance was both his genius and the thing that left the path unfinished. That silence defined the limitation of his legacy, a magnificent first step, offered with unmatched generosity, and then a path the listener had to find elsewhere. And here's the uncomfortable part. The part that's really about you, not about him. You can love Alan Watts for 20 years and still never practice for 20 minutes. You can understand no self beautifully and still defend your ego like a starving wolf the moment someone criticizes you. The gap between understanding and practice isn't a Watts problem, it's a human one. He's just the version of it that came with a particularly beautiful voice. So what does actual practice look like? It means sitting for 10 minutes without a soundtrack. Watching your speech when frustration arrives, keeping one precept for one day, finding a teacher. The practice doesn't need to be dramatic, it needs to be real. Not because silence is more spiritual than music, because at some point you need to find out what your mind does when nobody is decorating it for you. Alan Watts is playing on someone's phone right now. The algorithm keeps surfacing him for new listeners. The voice keeps doing what it always did, making the ineffable feel, briefly, obvious. That gift was real. It mattered enormously. It opened doors for millions who might never have looked in Buddhism's direction. Zen returns to a specific image again and again, the finger pointing at the moon. The teaching points toward reality, but it is not reality itself. A person who falls in love with the finger has missed the entire direction of the pointing. They found something smaller to worship instead. Alan Watts was not the moon, but wow, could he point. The Dhamma is traditionally called ehipassiko. Come and see for yourself. Not come and admire. Not come and collect quotes. Come and test it. The investigation is the path. Watts gave you the door. Buddhism built what's behind it. The recordings will keep playing. The algorithm will keep delivering them to exactly the right person at exactly the right moment of searching. And if that person, if you, uses what you hear as a starting point rather than a destination, then Watts did exactly what he came to do. So thank the door, then step through. If this video opened something, share it with someone who keeps pressing play on the same recordings without knowing why. They might be ready for the next question. This channel has spent months exploring exactly what's on the other side of the door Watts built. The schools, the teachers, the practices, the debates that shaped Buddhism into what it is today. Everything is there when you're ready. Subscribe for a new video every week. See you there.